Freedom, a concept of slave. Part 2, Feedom at work. The intimate connection between the concept of freedom and that of equality in Sophism, Cynicism, Stoicism, and Judeo-Christianity, has been the object of our investigation in From Freedom to Feedom, which has showed, on one hand, that their hand-in-hand development, as a result of the increasingly subjective standpoint from which the relationship with the sacred was viewed, was marked by an increasing abstraction, and, on the other hand, that the subversive potential they possessed intrinsically developed accordingly. The time is now to go further into the examination of the influence of this twin concept on the formation of the civilization which is known as the European civilization, and, beyond this, on the Teutonic spirit. To begin with, there is some wisdom in dwelling on the fallaciousness of two related theories on the early Germans. The first is the theory concerning their freedom and equality and their so-called self-government, which had its origins in the German nationalist aspirations of the 18th century, only to be furthered in the 19th century by the liberal claim that the political institutions of the ancient Germans, as described by Tacitus, were essentially of a democratic and constitutionalist character. Even though it was brushed aside conclusively as a romantic fancy a long time ago, it seems to be assumed and proclaimed again by the Marxists who make up much of the current self-styled anti-establishment intelligentsia on our continent nowadays. Equality of all free men, and not equality of all men, formed the basis of the ancient Teutonic society. Out of the four classes the early Germanic society was composed of, namely the nobiles, the freeborn, the freedmen, and the slaves, only the first two had political power, while the freedmen and the slaves did not enjoy any political rights, nor did women. These were not in any sense members of the legal community, yet the unfree might be manumitted, and emancipation usually secured to them half-freedom. Such half-free persons, or serfs, Hoerigen, Leeten, Aldean, were capable of rights, but they continued to be marked off from the full freemen by the lack of liberty of domicile, an essential measure to curtail traffic. In fact, early Germanic society was not democratic, it was very conscious of differences in class and rank. The primary sources are so clear about it that it is hard not to think that it was merely to push their political agenda that 19th-century German nationalists deliberately ignored the fundamental and critical distinction between equality of all men and equality of all free men. The second is the assumption that the Christian proclamation of the primacy and the supremacy of certain rights and interests of the individual over any of his duties to the state could resonate with the very high idea of personal independence, the emphasis on the value and importance of the individual man as compared with the state, which was characteristic of the Teutonic tribes. It is based on the mistaken and somehow romantic notion that liberty and independence had the same meaning for the German and for the Christians. With a reference to the Anglo-Saxon freeman that can be applied to a large extent to all German freemen, Turner sets the record straight in this respect. In talking of the Anglo-Saxon freeman, we must not let our minds expatiate on an ideal character which eloquence and hope have invested with charms almost magical. No utopian state, no paradise of such a pure republic as reason can conceive, but as human nature can neither establish nor support, is about to shine around us when we describe the Anglo-Saxon freeman. A freeman among our ancestors was not that dignified independent being, lord of the lion heart and eagle eye, which our poets fancy under this appellation. He was rather an Anglo-Saxon not in a servile state, not property attached to the land as the slaves were. He was freed from the oppression of arbitrary bondage, he was often a servant, and had a master, but he had the liberty to quit the service of one lord and to choose another. Their state of freedom had great benefits and some inconvenience. It was based on rights and duties. This is not to say that there is not truth to the belief that the modern concept of representative and constitutional government developed gradually from the political institutions of the early Germans, and, in the last analysis, from their notion of individual liberty and their system of common laws. It is true insofar and only insofar as it takes account of the involutory and parodic character of the whole process. In ancient Germany, parity referred in a legitimate and virile way only to free men and nobles, beyond any difference in nature. However, the democratization and the inversion of this concept led to the egalitarian immortal principle, precisely as a tool of worldwide subversion. In short, it is enough to desecrate principles such as this one, to secularize and to democratize them, so as to make them an ideal for any individual whatsoever, so as to make them weapons of subversion and to arrive at anarchism and individualism, that is to say, to errors and attitudes which would result in the negation and the destruction of the spiritual plane, the only one to which these principles could apply legitimately. The ultimate and practical consequences of this illegitimate conceptual extension of inborn quality of freedom to all men in the political domain are well summarized in Men Among the Ruins. Where there is equality there cannot be freedom. What exists is not pure freedom, but rather the many individual, domesticated, and mechanized freedoms, in a state of reciprocal limitation. Paradoxically, that kind of freedom could approximately be realized in the system that is most opposite to liberal preferences, namely, in the system in which the social question is resolved in such a way as to guarantee certain privileges for a small group, at the cost of the total subjugation of everybody else. If carried to its extreme consequences, the figure of a tyrant would then be the most perfect concretization of this concept or ideal of formless freedom. While, down to Carolingian times, only the freemen of the tribe had the right and the duty to take part in the thing, the assembly, experience in democratic conditions, such as those the occupied countries of our continent are under, shows increasingly that the indiscriminate granting of civil and political rights to any adult who is not disqualified by the laws of the country, without distinction of any kind, such as race and sex, is a recipe for such a disaster. Through popular vote, universal suffrage. There was, as it is clear from all available primary sources, no such thing as a concept of freedom in the early Germanic world. As has been seen, lack of conceptualization of freedom should not be regarded as a minus, but as a plus. Freedom, rather than being conceptualized, the object of ethical or political reflection, was essentially experienced, in the fullest sense of the term and, so to speak, hereditarily. The nobles were originally those who, being born from parents long possessed of freedom, were invested with the dignities of the commonwealth, that is to say, with full citizenship and, in particular, with the right to assume arms. As in ancient Rome, freedom was simply another expression for the right of citizenship in its widest sense. So, in this Genossenschaft, freedom could be defined as having been under the law, provided that law is understood, not in the secular sense of the word, but in the Aryan sense of dharma and artha, whether at an individual or at a collective level, in a Greek context, as ethos, and, in a Roman context, as use. Law among the early Germans was regarded as customary, sacred, eternal, and unchangeable. The object of government, they thought, was not to make new laws, but to maintain the good old laws. Eva, the old High German term for law is custom, habitual practice, refers to both the legal and religious sphere. In relation to the developments below, it is worth noting that in late Old High German it was confined to the meaning matrimonium, a legally contracted marriage. A lot of water would pass under the bridge before the old Germanic institutions would be contaminated and distorted by non-Aryan egalitarian doctrines and views. While it does not fall within the scope of this study to reconstruct this process, it is important to remember that egalitarianism can be traced to the Deuteronomic Code and the prophets, to Yahweh's burning compassion for the oppressed, and that the expression it naturally found in the organization of some early oppressed Christian communities went underground in the institutionalized Church of the Middle Ages only to resurface more acutely in so-called secular forms in later times, beginning with the emphasis on liberty and equality as natural rights that is found in Calvin, Hobbes, as well as in the United States Declaration of Independence. The way in which the various ecclesiae in different localities originally organized themselves varied, though, at least in some, local leaders, both men and women, were democratically elected. Likewise, major issues facing the expanding church were dealt with in council and often by consensus. As the development of Christian orthodoxy resulted in increasing hierarchical structures of the church, in order to ostracize and to control heretical apocalyptic and millenarian factions, where women shared an equal status with men, more radical groups emerged which have retrieved those socially subversive texts within the Bible which demand liberation, justice, and equity for the poor and oppressed and have kept alive the utopian prophetic vision of an egalitarian and participatory society both in the church and in the public arena, while others, inspired by the same prophetic vision, but less utopians in their expectations and usually less radical in their strategies, have likewise struggled for freedom. In doing so they have helped to develop social structures which have found particular expression in representative forms of democracy. To put it bluntly, Christianity, or the religion of the Bible, is emphatically and distinctively, the religion of the equal and common brotherhood of mankind. And this feature embodies the only solid foundation for the principle of democracy. Now, the Christian notion of brotherhood is nothing else than freedom and equality. It is well known since the works of Bachofen that equality is the foundation and the driving force of any society in which females, especially mothers, wield familial and political authority, and, more precisely since the works of Evola, that any society characterized by the actual predominance of feminine values over manly values can be considered as a gynecocracy, irrespective of whether it is actually managed by females or by males, by, in the case at hand, feminine males. Freedom as a concept played almost no part in intrinsically matriarchal societies such as the African one and the Arabic one, any more than it did in intrinsically patriarchal societies, in which manly values prevailed over feminine ones, informing and shaping these societies in all their aspects and in all their areas. Since the concept of freedom first penetrated our civilization through ancient Greece under the influence of philosophers who were all of Semitic background, the question arises on the historical plane as to whether this concept was meant to act as an agent of destruction. Whether or not it was meant to act as such, it did have destructive, poisonous, effects on the social texture, on the economic system, and on the political institutions of Indo-European peoples, through the ferment and restlessness it caused in the less thoroughbred elements which made up, so to speak, the residue of these stocks, and which, by their nature, were receptive to non- or even anti-Aryan values. To destroy white traditional society meant to undermine its foundations, that is, the family, and to undermine the family meant to emancipate women and, to start with, to free her internally, to enslave her to herself, so as to use her as a medium to release and turn loose infrahuman forces. Germanic institutions, to be fully understood, must be studied on the basis of kin. A family, smaller or larger, held its members united by the strongest of bonds. They made common front against an enemy, and kept peace among themselves. The word sib means both peace and relationship. To give this little Senate laws, to govern his immediate family and do his duty as member of the larger family, was chief business of the Germanic freeman aside from his vocation of warrior and his avocation of huntsman. Every member of the family was subordinate to its head, not simply under his control, but at his mercy. He could punish, sell, and, in primitive times, kill. We must here as before clear our minds of modern sentiment, and keep in sight the rigid nature of household organization. The sense of kin took just precedence of all human bonds. Peace, goodwill, the sense of honor, loyalty to friend and kinsman, brotherly affection, all were plants that found in the Germanic home that congenial warmth they needed for their earliest stages of growth. Blood relationship and mutual peace conditioned each other. The family tie engendered the earliest notions of duty, whether to the living or to the dead, and this sense of duty is the moral foundation of all Germanic history. Alive, the head of the house exacted obedience and respect, fostered order and justice. Dead, he was the object of cult, grew mightier with lapse of time, and as a tribal god sanctioned wider and deeper laws of society. His fireplace was the primitive council chamber, his grave was the primitive altar. The heaviest punishment was expulsion from the family, and banishment, the crown of sorrow for a German. The wretched victim of such a fate was cut off from all protection of law and order, and renounced the benefits of civilization. Thus at the other extreme of fortune from the proud head of a proud and powerful clan stood the clanless man, the exile, the outlaw, who had no protecting relative, no strong kinsman, no gold friend and lord. Blood brotherhood is a very pretty word for our ears, but in the brave old days it was no metaphor. The soul was thought to abide chiefly in the warm blood, as well as in the breath and the eyes. The ties of blood being the most sacred known to the ancients, the one band of society, the beginning and chief sanction of religion, it was natural that any conflict of duty, any case of doubt which way the claim of blood should draw one, must have formed chief material for their tragedy. Originally, the family or clan made a definite sphere or community of life. Outside of it the homeless man felt indeed that chaos had come again. The free German was essentially a warrior, and such farming as he had was in the hands of his wife, who was helped by slaves and the weaker members of the household. The primitive German wife, says Lippert, span wool, made clothes, cared for the fowls, and tried her hand at raising barley. There was a total absence of sentiment in Germanic life, but a householder respected the capable mistress of his home because she was capable, and he accorded her a certain supremacy, because only thus could she do her best work and bring about the most good for the family. She had, therefore, full sway in her own realm. To leave a son who should be head of the house, and therefore its priest, who would perform its rites according to the good old custom, and train up his own children to the same belief and practice, was one of the foundations of family life. Household gods were no fiction in those days. To marry meant literally to make free, from the High Old German free, where free still had the sense of one's own kinsman, since marriage was the means by which a kindred based on blood ties was enlarged by the admission of an outsider who by that legal act came to enjoy the rights and protection of that kindred. From ownership of land, woman was probably excluded in all Germanic tribes, and this Salic law represents the general point of view. But custom is law, and custom had very early begun to give woman a certain legal standing. It is popularly supposed that women were lifted to their present place mainly by the influence of the church and of chivalry. This is in great measure true. Moreover, women were not members of the state, but were under control of father or brother, who punished or rewarded them. The oldest English law is full of this doctrine. Refractory wife or daughter, where stripes are unavailing, is sold or even given away. Yet her importance in the household and in the farm gave her a certain responsibility, leadership, and dignity. The sense of kinship was so strong that, if a free woman married below her rank, she came into a painful position, and must lose either her husband or her freedom, that foreigners who came into a country without friends and kin behind them, and made to stay, were in danger of unfreedom. A year and a day they might bide, and after that it was often slavery. But the wayfaring man who had definite objects in view was welcome to this boundless hospitality. The famous German hospitality praised by Tacitus was limited to transient guests, who had certain forms with which he must comply. Now, with such a sanction for the family, with such necessity for a head, for strict gradations of birth, we can see how the iron weight of custom and religious tradition, and not the feeble breath of sentiment, inclined the scale in favor of German women. We must remember, too, what an important part the German woman played in matters of divination and religion. There was abundant reverence for the prophetic and sacred character of woman, but it was a reverence based on religious tradition, and was at the farthest possible remove from medieval or modern chivalry. We are hardly to think that the German attributed superior insight to woman as woman, the gods spoke through her. The Veleda, whom Tacitus mentions, both in this passage and in the histories, was a typical wise woman, who had prophesied the defeat of the Roman legions. Then Christianity banned the old sanctities and mysteries, and the prophetic Maidenea Virgo grew little by little into a woman who clung to the disgraced divinities, had dealings with Satan, was guilty of the lowest vices and the most disgraceful motives, did nothing but harm, caused storm, ruin, pestilence, and death. Marriage in antiquity was contracted within the kinship group, the demus. The purpose of endogamy was to produce an heir and a lineage while maintaining the purity of blood, transmitting wealth, honor and status, and ensuring the hereditary perpetuation of the hierarchical principle. Marriage had thus socio-economical, racial, political and spiritual motivations and implications into which sexuality and feeling did not come into play. This traditional foundational concept of the formation and of the perpetuation of ancient European societies was undermined and shattered by Christianity. To be sure, Jesus Christ did not reject marriage. Nor did he explicitly approve of it. He was more concerned with marriage in heaven and marriage in the last days, as well as with the issues of divorce and adultery. Marriage was considered as a lesser evil for Paul, whose emphasis on sex in marriage says a lot about the kind of public to which he preached, and the Pauline tradition. Celibacy is preferable to marriage, in view of the fact that marriage inevitably brings with it a concern for the affairs of the world and thereby hinders total devotion to the mission of the Church at the turn of the ages. Basically, the contrast is one of impurity versus holiness. Christians are urged to behave not like the Gentiles, but to take a wife in holiness and honor. The problem here is sexuality and desire. It is the fear of filthy, unbridled sexuality that comes to the fore, so that marriage is regarded as a protection against this desire and as an expression of holiness. The unity of husband and wife is strongly emphasized, but the basis for the union should not be carnal desire, an antithesis which was unknown to patricians, but Christian love and holiness. Love, instead of, and as opposed to, blood, is to be the foundation of the family, is to unify the family. Love as the reflection of the love of God is also pivotal to the Paulinian concept of new life in Christ. The new life is realized in love. Love must be the determining reality for everything the Christian or the Christian community does. The liberty in Christ must show itself especially in this, that believers are to be servants of one another through love. The Christian view of family is formed in the image of the Holy Family. The word and heart are put into marriage. Peter is intent on improving the quality of marriages, especially in situations where the husband rejects the word. In Peter's view, the key to acceptance of the word is through the heart. If wives show the right kind of heart, husbands will be won over to the word. Mark, 2, wants to put heart and the word into marriage. Both texts conclude with a little note that the idea of a heart-filled marriage is important for God. This sentimentalist view of marriage formed part of a far-reaching attempt to undermine the patriarchal character of the traditional Roman family and culture, and, even beyond, the very essence of kinship. Jesus Christ calls the whole nature of the kinship bond into question, placing above this bond a bond of fellowship in a common obedience to God. When confronted with the demands of his family, Jesus proposes a new radical moral standard that threatens the most basic family loyalties and engenders the most difficult conflicts between family and religious commitment. He sought to compromise the role, the status, and the aura of fathers, going so far as to assert, "Call no one your father," implying that the overarching authority of the pater familias has no place in the community of the faithful. Only children, barren women, angel-like beings, and eunuchs can enter the kingdom of God. Much of the synoptic material portrays Jesus' tension with his own kin and his call of the disciples to give his mission a higher priority than the love of their family. Its most pointed expression is the demand that the disciple not bury his father, but leave the dead to bury their own dead, a saying so counter to the family values of the ancient world that it is practically unparalleled in all ancient literature. When Jesus asks his followers to leave family behind, he is talking about a particular kind of family, the patriarchal family in which men held nearly absolute power over women. It is mainly this family that Jesus finds objectionable. It is essentially this family that has no place in the Christian community. It was not Jesus Christ who said, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." For that matter, it was not Paul either. Had the subordination of women to men been unambiguously recalled in the Gospels, where, of course, some sensible things about the natural and normative relations between man and woman in the context of an intrinsically patriarchal society can be found, other texts, which express clearly the notion of equality or identity between the sexes, would have mitigated it, all the more so as the very categories of male and female are more or less implicitly called in question in favor of an ideal of humanity beyond natural gender inequality. Conversely, the followers of Jesus Christ were implicitly called to reject blood kinship as a foundation of society, of culture, of civilization, in favor of a new family. The first Christians can be seen as a people who wanted to actualize Jesus' vision of the kingdom. Even if we allow for considerable exaggeration in Luke's nostalgic and romanticizing summaries, we can still imagine a group excitedly celebrating table fellowship, sharing resources, and energetically preaching and healing in the temple area. This group would have heard Jesus' message about the dangers of all-encompassing family loyalty. They would have been attempting to live in a new kind of family community in which all those who were disciples of Jesus would be better able to focus on what was really important, teaching and living the gospel. The Jesus of the Gospels used radical anti-family devoted listeners, shake them loose from the ties that kept them from being true servants of God. And they, in response, changed the ways they thought about family, and, more significantly, the way they lived as family. In this Christian family community, four main changes can be identified. Firstly, the emphasis on the child as a unique individual. Secondly, the movement toward equality. Paul's assertion of the equality of rights, of authority and of obligations between wives and husbands was not ignored. Unlike the patriarchal Jewish and Roman marriages, early Christian marriages were notable for their emerging egalitarianism. While it would be anachronistic to claim that these Christians were feminists or that they believed in the kind of equality many envision today, it is fair to say that the first Christians responded to Jesus' message and practice by trying to reshape their marriages so that they would be more equal. Thirdly, the rejection of hierarchy. The apocryphal Acts of the Apostles is full of stories of young men who leave behind possessions, of young women who sneak out of their husbands' marriage beds into other bedrooms where Christian worship is taking place, of disciples of Christ who come together despite diverse backgrounds, of women who give up their high status as wives to slaves of God are common in Christian literature of the time. In sum, Christians who turned away from marriage did so, at least in part, because they rejected the upper-class status that marriage would bring them. Instead, they identified with a small Christian community that included people from all walks of life, and they called this community their family. We know that the baptism of adult Christians included the formula found in Galatians 3:27-28. You have clothed yourselves with Christ Jesus. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Many scholars have come to believe that this formula was understood by the earliest Christians not just spiritually, but concretely. To be baptized, then, was to affirm that all socially important distinctions were no longer significant. A Christian was a brother or sister to all. Christian families crossed class lines and in doing so repudiated social norms. Fourthly, the inclusion of all is the logical conclusion of such premises. Clearly, it means the disintegration of any blood kinship into the so-called human family. The early Christian movement brought into question not only ethnic but also family solidarities. The Christian message embraced individuals, who were bound together, to be sure, in a new metaphorical family as brothers and sisters in Christ, but did not necessarily live, and were not required to live, within the solidarity of a Christian family. The practical effect of the early Christian movement was not to solidify but to undermine family loyalties for a significant proportion of its adherents. Whatever partial parallels there may be outside Christianity to the notion that God might take precedence over family ties, the fact remains that early Christianity became distinguished by this characteristic, whose importance led to a fundamental reconsideration of the worth of family loyalties and of the family as such. This reconsideration could express itself in more or less radical forms. At the less radical end of the scale, Christians could be encouraged to reckon that their commitment to Jesus and the demands of his mission might require them both to forego family commitments and to forge alternative kinship relations with fellow believers outside the family circle. Early Christians did not just endeavor to form alternative kinship relations and an alternative kind of community, which, after all and in theory, could have existed alongside with the traditional Roman institution of family at the bottom of the existing order. However, they sought to undermine the familia from within, targeting essentially women, slaves and children. We see, indeed, in private houses workers in wool and leather, and fullers, and persons of the most uninstructed and rustic character, not venturing to utter a word in the presence of their elders and wiser masters, but when they get hold of the children privately, and certain women as ignorant as themselves, they pour forth wonderful statements, to the effect that they ought not to give heed to their father and to their teachers, but should obey them, that the former are foolish and stupid, and neither know nor can perform anything that is really good, being preoccupied with empty trifles, that they alone know how men ought to live, and that, if the children obey them, they will both be happy themselves, and will make their home happy also. And while thus speaking, if they see one of the instructors of youth approaching, or one of the more intelligent class, or even the father himself, the more timid among them become afraid, while the more forward incite the children to throw off the yoke, whispering that in the presence of father and teachers they neither will nor can explain to them any good thing, seeing they turn away with aversion from the silliness and stupidity of such persons as being altogether corrupt, and far advanced in wickedness, and such as would inflict punishment upon them, but that if they wish to avail themselves of their aid, they must leave their father and their instructors, and go with the women and their playfellows to the women's apartments, or to the leather shop, or to the fuller's shop, that they may attain to perfection, and by words like these they gain them over. In Juvenal, too, women are depicted as the main focus of early Christian clandestine proselytizing tactics. It is clear that Celsus believes that women make up a considerable part of the early Christian population, but, from his account, it becomes just as evident that women are not merely followers of the early Christian evangelists, but they are also actively involved in the missionary enterprise. Once Christianity was established, the forces at work in it were left free to further the process of undermining of the kinship system. Marriage laws were dramatically changed, and this change had momentous consequences at both ends of the social scale. At both ends of the social spectrum, the Christian emperors introduced laws that modified the ways in which people married. For the highest classes, the new legislation further restricted the groups within which marriage was permitted, thus narrowing the choice of marriage partner. The traditional system was concerned with the provision of an heir to inherit family property. It allowed marriage to close kin, marriages to close affines or widows of close kin, the transfer of children by adoption, and concubinage, a form of secondary union. Gregory banned all four practices. Later, in 720, Pope Gregory II forbade all marriages with consanguineal or affinal kin. In 732, Gregory III instructed Boniface that marriages were not to be contracted within the seventh degree. Of the four main aspects of traditional marriage and family, that is, close marriages, union with affines, adoption and concubinage, the fate of the widows, which were targeted by medieval Christianity, the devastating effects brought about by and the underlying reasons behind the changes in the treatment of the latter merits special attention. From its inception, the Church had grown as a temporal power through gifts and donations, particularly from rich widows. So much wealth had the Church acquired in this way that in July 370 the Emperor Valentinian addressed a ruling to the Pope that male clerics and unmarried ascetics should not hang around the houses of women and widows and try to worm themselves and their churches into the women's bequests at the expense of the women's families and blood relations. The early Church's extolling of virginity and its discouragement of second marriages helped it to increase the number of single women who would leave bequests to the Church. This process of inhibiting a family from retaining its property and promoting its alienation accelerated with the answers that Pope Gregory I gave to some questions posed in 597 AD by Augustine, the first Archbishop of Canterbury, concerning his new charges. It is clear that from the beginning the interests of the new religious community lay in a reorganization of the laws of inheritance, and especially in a loosening of the old legal family ties. Here the aim of the Church was in the direction of individualism, making the individual independent of his kinsmen. Since the marriage policies introduced by the Church made it more likely that it would inherit property from wealthy people, insofar as they could not longer use interfamilial marriage alliances to keep full control of family estates within their kinship group, it is arguable that these policies benefited the Church financially. One result of Christian influence on Roman marriage law was to make bigamy for the first time a crime in the empire. The classical concept of consensual marriage, which depended upon the continuing consent of both parties to remain married to each other, had made it nearly impossible for a Roman to contract a bigamous marriage. Under the Christian emperors, however, divorce became the sole procedure for terminating a marriage between living partners, and the grounds for divorce became more restricted. As a result of these changes, bigamy for the first time became a legal problem. In addition, Constantine made it legally impossible for a Roman subject to have both a wife and a concubine simultaneously. This alteration marked a break with earlier practice and illustrates, as does the development of the bigamy problem, the gradual enactment of Christian sexual teachings into public law. The legal enforcement of monogamy as the only form of marriage by the Church had long-term devastating side effects. To be sure, monogamy was mandated in the late Roman Empire as the only proper form of sexual expression and family organization. In the old days, however, formal monogamy could be reconciled with effectively polygynous relationships in the social and sexual spheres. Greek and Roman societies accommodated multiple sexual relations for married men. Monogamous norms were even relaxed in times of serious crisis. Near the end of the Peloponnese War, massive male casualties justified a temporary exception that allowed men to father legitimate offspring with one woman other than their own wife. Christianity maintained and reinforced monogamous norms in their most rigid form. Had it limited itself to reinforcing monogamy, it would have been a lesser evil, especially for the Germanic kinship group. What made it particularly destructive for the clan social, mental and emotional balance and also for the whole society was that it was hardened, on one hand, by the radical condemnation of extramarital sexual congress, and, on the other hand, by the consideration of love as the only foundation of marriage and as the only element likely to sustain it, thus causing the two separate aspects of parenthood and sexuality to be considered as inextricable. A recipe for disaster was that marital relationship became the only legitimate context for erotic involvement, which amounts to not being able to distinguish between Venus and Juno anymore. Generally speaking, the imposition of social monogamy on the aforementioned basis and, what's more, the legal acknowledgement of only one type of marriage, namely that which was distinguished by marital affection, as opposed to the several types of marital unions which existed both in the organically hierarchical ancient Roman and Germanic society, coupled with the enjoinment of one ethic upon all people, irrespective of wealth, status and sex, were part of the leveling policy of the Church, in keeping with Christian egalitarianism, that is, with the subversive propensity to lower the noble whilst raising the humble. The enactments of the Christian emperors made marriage for the first time legally available to the low-born. Successive laws transformed the informal couplings of slaves, contubernium, into legitimate matrimony, with all its rights and consequences. With the gradual imposition of monogamy, the number of marriageable women increased. More poor men could find mates and raise families. They were given a stake in settled society, and the numbers of wandering outlaws decreased. From a racial and eugenic standpoint, it must be pointed out that the decrease of the numbers of wandering outlaws only resulted in the increase of the numbers of settled outlaws. A married criminal certainly does not cease to be a criminal. Strict monogamous marriage, too, would have been a lesser evil, had it not been pushed to its extreme consequences by the sanctification of the consensual marriage and its implicit promotion of the sophism of the equality of men and women, as reinforced by the claim that, if the husband has authority over his wife's body, the wife, too, has authority over her husband's body. If it was extremely difficult for Christian marriage to gain ground, since it was in stark contrast on several essential points with the pattern of married and family life in ancient Rome and in ancient Germany, whose laws allowed in certain cases repudiation or divorce, the indissolubility of the Christian marriage meant the primacy of the logic of the couple on that of the line. This feature was further accentuated by the emphasis laid by the Church on the freedom of the personal consent of the couple. In the context of those times, this attitude amounted, by instituting a new form of autonomy of the subject, to considering the interests of families and clans, that is, the transmission of inheritance, of secondary importance. By institutionalizing an autonomous conjugality to the detriment of broader forms of adherence and of solidarity, community, lineage, and extended family, Christian marriage initiated a long process of individualization, whose final result was love-based modern marriage. Today, it is the main cause of divorce. Engels pointed out that monogamy does not by any means make its appearance in history as the reconciliation of man and woman, still less as the highest form of such a reconciliation. On the contrary, it appears as the subjugation of one sex by the other, as the proclamation of a conflict between the sexes entirely unknown hitherto in prehistoric times. He was just too narrow-minded to realize, or too cunning to reveal, which one would end up being subjugated. For, since there is no such thing as equality between men and women, this is what consensuality would really mean in the long run. The fact that both the man's and his future wife's consent was necessary for marriage meant that it was a contract between equals, since neither one could impose consensus upon the other partner. This means that in principle the bargaining position of women in such a marriage pattern is relatively strong. A woman could try to select the kind of husband that suited her. So, to crown it all, the ratification of consensual marriage by Alexander III in the Decretal Veniens ad nos was a deadly blow at the root of the European traditional patriarchal authority. It instigated a family revolution which can be considered as largely responsible for the individualism that characterizes the West. From a social and economic standpoint, through its precepts for marriage, childbearing, sexuality and family roles, Christianity fostered the rise of the actual nuclear family, a social unit which was in turn a precondition of the Industrial Revolution. As has been seen in the Jewels of the Papacy, the whole Germanic tradition was twisted and assimilated into a Christian worldview by the act of euhemerization and by the use of various literary devices, so that the Christian message imposed itself upon the Germanic tradition in the heroic epic poems of the Middle Ages. Whether or not the fatherhood of God appeals with peculiar force to the German, the fact remains that the Christian glorification of the Almighty Father with a capital F was paralleled by a twofold process of disempowerment of the German warrior as a father and of consequent empowerment of the German woman, and an increasing glorification of feminine values. The passage from antiquity to the Christian era, besides altering the structure of the family architecture, altered the system of relationships between women, men and children. It is by religious assertion that women put a distance between their will and that of their family, their father, and their husband. The rules of marriage dictated by the Church and the indissolubility of marriage hindered the will of the fathers in their choice of alliances, because they could no longer form and break up alliances whenever they wished. The man lost the power to become a father as he wished. The position of the Church, which did not approve of divorce, refused to consecrate remarriages, and discouraged the remarriage of widows, made it more difficult to find a wife. However, Christian ideas were not anchored to the same extent in all walks of life. Heathen traditions were still present. The place of the child was still determined by the will of the father. Yet, the influence of Christianity and of its morality brought about a difference in the legal situation of legitimate children and illegitimate children. As early as in the late Roman Empire, that is in the Christian Roman Empire, any child born out of illicit unions was legally a bastard and an outcast. Besides, prior to the conversion of the Germanic tribes, women, through marriage, appeased conflicts, and, by recognizing their illegitimate children, encouraged the harmony of the kinship group. Therefore, it is not difficult to understand how devastating the canon laws on illegitimate children were to be for the organic structure of the traditional Germanic kinship group. Once, through these laws, women lost the regulatory role they had as subjects of alliances within it, nor is it difficult to fathom the new role she was spurred to play within it. Bearing children, which might have been done by a succession of wives or simultaneous wives in an earlier period, and supervising domestic activities, which had been previously shared by all female members of the family, were now the exclusive duty of one wife. Further, a married woman had greater responsibility for land management than her Merovingian ancestors. She was thus expected not only to produce children but also to administer a complex family economy. It may be that the introduction of the Christian model of marriage did not alter the role of the wife, yet it increased her responsibilities in the economic sphere, the sphere of conflicts, and empowered her as an individual. Now, if there is some evidence that the shift from polygamy to monogamy which occurred in Carolingian times resulted in an emphasis on the domestic responsibilities and duties of the aristocratic wife, there is every indication that the imposition of monogamy addressed the needs of the lower estates, that is, the peasantry and, above all, the middle class. The individual household, and also a certain degree of monogamy, were economic necessities for the artisan and peasant. As the merchant business was independent of a household, it was of little importance whether he had a housewife or not. Marriage and a household became a luxury for him, whereas it had been an economic necessity. If he were frugal, he need not marry at all, unless he took a wife not as a housekeeper, but as an heiress. If his trading profits were large enough, he could transfer the management of his household to hirelings. Thus, in consequence of the unlimited profits of trade, the wives of merchants, and to some extent of professional men, were freed from household duties, as well as from work generally, in the course of the 15th and 16th centuries. They found time to interest themselves in questions outside their former mental horizon. But concomitant with this emancipation, the traditional form of marriage tended to become an article of luxury in mercantile and humanist circles, resulting in a loosening of sexual ties, above all in Italy, the home of humanism. With the impetuosity of youth, the upper middle class burst the bonds of the patriarchal family of monogamy. Another key and decisive factor in the spreading of the twin concepts of freedom and equality in the Middle Ages was the rise of the bourgeoisie and of the bourgeois mentality. The trader, as a man who wanted to do a lucrative business and, therefore, who was totally oriented to the money value of things, could only see the world as one great market. He never thought beyond his business, which received his entire energy. This demanded the instrumental ability to be both a speculating calculator and a negotiator who was concerned primarily with means rather than goals. To the bourgeois, freedom and equality of all are presuppositions of economic exchange. To the bourgeois, equality is both a presupposition and a constitutive feature of the market. Since the practice of exchange requires agents to abstract from all social differences except the roles of buyer and seller, it can apply to anyone who owns something marketable. Once labor power becomes a commodity, therefore, the market promises equal access for all, or at least for all whose labor power is employable, and thus equal opportunity for every product or personal capacity to prove its equal value with others. To the bourgeois, freedom means essentially market freedom, conceived of as the absence of external coercion. In commodity exchange, the complete freedom of the individual is posited. Voluntary transaction, no force on either side. Since the market offers equal access to all, it offers equal freedom for all. In Roman law, the service is defined as one who may not enter into exchange for the purpose of acquiring anything for himself. Freedom and equality as the presuppositions of economic exchange are exactly the opposite of the freedom and equality in the world of antiquity. The Greek paradigm was dichotomous, and gave priority to the freedom of household heads to participate in the polis as equal citizens, free from constraints of foreignness, slavery, industrial or domestic labor, womanhood or immaturity, any of which justified unequal treatment. Greek conceptions of freedom and equality conflicted with those prioritized by the exchange paradigm mainly insofar as they reflected the restriction of property ownership to citizens. But if non-citizens, foreigners especially, but also freedmen and slaves, could obtain commodities and money, they would meet citizens in the marketplace as equal trading partners, free to strike or refuse a deal as they pleased. So with the development of markets and exchange paradigm of social intercourse, prioritizing more universalistic conceptions of freedom and equality, would gain currency and undermine the older political one. The rise of the bourgeoisie and, with it, the spreading of the values of indiscriminate equality and individual and universal freedom can be attributed to the breakdown of feudality, but only in part, since feudal society, whose greatness in terms of political, military, social and economic achievements should not distract one from acknowledging that it was built on the ruins of a society of a higher traditional character, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Two of these are relevant to our topic. Firstly, if feudality was a society dominated by a vast network of mutual relationships based almost entirely on personal loyalty and service, the fact that the personal bonds of mutual loyalty and military service were no longer exclusively tribal, as they were among Germanic tribes before their Christianization, weakened them significantly in practice. Then, if, in the early Middle Ages, social mobility was, if not utterly impossible, except through the Church, which, as always, led the way, at least strictly delimited, the strict feudal hierarchy began to fracture under the impact of other, mainly economic and military, factors, which, in the last analysis, can also be brought back to the weakening of tribal bonds, as service, from a clan matter, became more and more a matter for specialists. After the migrations of the Germanic tribes and their Christianization, the contrast between freedom and unfreedom lost definiteness, the unfree securing legal personality and thereby becoming folkfellows. Besides this, whole classes of the unfree moved upward, as settled rent-paying peasants, into the class of the half-free, which was thus notably increased. Where the old folk nobility maintained itself against extinction by the kingship, it developed into an estate superior also in law to the commonalty. Thus there were gradually differentiated four blood estates: the noble, the free, the half-free, Houriga, serfs, and the unfree, Nechtha. This fourfold legal hierarchy of freedom found visible expression in a scale of varying wergelds. But development soon went further. Many of the demands of Christian practice caused economic hardship. For instance, all agricultural labor had to cease on Sunday. Altered economic and political relations led in the Frankish period to a transformation of momentous consequences of this social organization of the Germanic epoch. The accumulation of riches in the hands of great landholders, secular and ecclesiastic, called into being a new aristocracy of wealth, while the royal service created a new nobility of office. Two new classes rose thereby above the estate of the common freeman. They coalesced readily, inasmuch as royal service was rewarded with land, and they wholly or partially absorbed the remnants of the old nobility of blood. The increased wergeld of the royal officials gave them also a higher legal worth. Although it was not yet an estate limited by birth, this aristocracy developed into such an estate, the estate of lords and princes, in the post-Frankish period, as a result of the transformation of powers of public office into heritable rights of lordship over land and people associated with the possession of land. In this context, land provided the facility for rising to a higher social or economic position or, on the contrary, for being relegated to a lower social or economic stratum. On one hand, many of the common freemen sank into the estate of serfs, and there met the slaves who had risen into it. For whoever was not in a position to protect his own free holding, but was forced to entrust it to a richer man and receive it back as a tenancy for rent, thereby eventually lowered his personal status. And so, here again, possession of land called into existence, first social and economic, and then legal distinctions. On the other hand, the successful management of even a medium-sized estate in the early Middle Ages was predicated on the service of numerous specially trained individuals, who may have been unfree yet were in the position to accumulate not just property but also money in the form of coinage to enhance their financial freedom. Another issue was that the Germanic common freeman ceased to be at once warrior and cultivator of the soil in Frankish times, and the army became a profession, a matter for specialists, with all the attendant negative consequences. On one hand, while a barbarian people, for example, was one and the same as its army when on the move, the exigencies of life on the road entailed dramatic social mobility within such a people's rank, which were open to anyone regardless of ethnic or social background who was adept and accomplished in battle. Simply put, specialized service in this case, on the battlefield could lead to social advancement. The ranks of feudal armies were increasingly filled with unfree individuals. In the early times of the Germanic society described by Tacitus, war was conducted with simple equipment. For example, only the most important warriors in a tribe owned swords. The warrior began to emerge as a distinctive profession when the cost of equipping him became substantial. The revolution in medieval warfare triggered by the switch to a heavily armored, mounted force during the Carolingian period steeply raised the cost of outfitting a fully equipped fighter. A chain-mail tunic alone was worth as much as a medium-sized piece of property, and the level of training an individual needed to perform his duties with distinction. Since there were never enough free vassals capable of fulfilling the military needs of an overlord, it fell to the king or magnate to equip the requisite number of unfree men and earmark them for lifelong training. Given the unique institutional history of the medieval empire, however, Ettonian and Salian military leaders were able, indeed constrained, to rely upon the imperial church for their troops. Hence, the earliest ministerials were drawn from the imperial church, which was in the very broadest sense part of the royal fisc, and from the royal fisc in the narrow sense. The fact that the royal right to muster the free and unfree milites was often delegated to ecclesiastics throughout the Middle Ages is the first reason why the fierce criticism faced by Charles Martel from some ecclesiastics for carrying out the Merovingian tradition of using the resources of the church for military purposes qualifies as a form of ingratitude. The second reason is that most of the wars of aggression launched by the Frankish kings were carried out under papal sanction. In order to spread the Christian faith, in his Admonition Generalis, Charles demanded that the Sanctus be sung at Mass in honor of the Dominus Sabaoth, the king of the armies. The third being that, when the non-Christian tribes they attacked on religious grounds later responded in kind, the wealth of the church was used to protect God's resources. An insatiable appetite for conquest mixed with religious zeal can already be felt in Gregory of Tours' writings. Wars, beginning with Charles, are explicitly identified with holy wars in Alcuin's prophetic flights. Not to mention that, by the late 11th century, when most Germanic, Slavic, and Baltic peoples were already converted, the great struggle between the Church and the Empire exacerbated domestic conflicts. The aforementioned need of a professionally trained mounted force created chivalry and the estate of knights. This estate of the knightage, Ordo Militaris, too, was at first a purely social fellowship of all men capable of knight service. It should be stressed that the earliest knights formed no uniform class, for there were of very different backgrounds. What identified them was their warrior function, even when that function was temporary. A man was a knight only as long as he wielded the arms his lord had issued to him, often briefly. Nor was 11th century knighthood synonymous with chivalry, which did not develop until the 12th century, or, indeed, with any particular standard of behavior. Robbers and mercenaries could be described as knights as easily as honorable and loyal soldiers. There was no equation between knights and vassals either. In many ways, these knights of the 11th century were closer to peasants than to their noble lords. Many seem to have been servile, legally unfree. Until the late Middle Ages, in the German Empire, serf knights, ministeriales, had to gain the permission of their lords to marry, as did any serf, even after they had become the de facto nobility of their regions. A similar social gulf also persisted in some French-speaking areas that bordered the empire. In France, the social status of knights and nobles drew closer together in the 12th century until they eventually fused as a single group in the 13th century. In the early Middle Ages, knighthood was not identical with nobility. In fact, the earliest knights were sharply differentiated from the noble they served. Only by the 14th century did the terms knight and noble become used almost interchangeably. On the whole, however, knights, cavalry fighters of fairly undistinguished backgrounds, quickly became an important part of the medieval social landscape. From the first, the idea of service was integral to the concept of knighthood. Knights followed their lords to war, to regional councils, and on excursions to cities and monasteries. As mounted service in war was as dear as it was distinguished, a knightly lineage was very soon added to the requirement of a knightly mode of life, and thereby transformed a professional into a blood estate. The feudal law included in one legal unit all persons of knightly birth and calling, and graded them within this unity in estates, according to their military rank. Distinctions between the status of freedom and of unfreedom in the territorial law did not affect membership in this estate, notwithstanding that they were the basis of gradations within it. Unfree persons found admission to it, namely the ministry, the servitors of the king and the landed aristocracy employed in military service. So long, therefore, as the distinction made by the territorial law outweighed in importance the unity that prevailed in the feudal law, the knightage was no status in the sense of the territorial law, and the feudal law was no law of status but simply a Rechtskreis, the aggregate of the legal rules that regulated the legal relations associated with feudal tenancy. The Sachsenspiegel still shows us this peculiar parallel growth of estates on the double basis of territorial and feudal law. Ultimately, the principles of the latter came to prevail. Persons of knightly birth separated themselves from all other classes of society as a blood estate, recognizable by their peculiar mode of life. But within this knightly or noble class, a unit both in self-consciousness and in law, the distinction between elements originally free and unfree continued to be reflected in a division between a higher and a lower nobility. The imposition of legal restrictions on the dubbing of knights of low birth in the late 12th century in Germany and in Spain shows that men of low birth were sometimes knighted prior to these times. In 1140, Roger II forbid the knighting of men who might disturb peace, in a move to check the rise of a rebellious movement by a wholesale dubbing and equipping of merchants and rich peasants. Hitherto, knights had been distinguished from the rest of society merely by their qualification in arms, which in turn had brought them relative wealth. Entry into knighthood and the attendant ceremony had been a simple formality that could be carried out by any knight for anyone's benefit, and, even though knighthood remained a secular institution, it was the Church that made the knight, and its symbolic, ritual, and ethical basis increasingly derived from the Church's conception of the order inherent in society. The Church conformed to a type of ethics that was more heroic and heathen than evangelical and that could not be reconciled with the principles of that dualistic and escapist spirituality, but it did so only apparently and in the initial stage. In fact, it strove to sway the martial ethos of the knighthood and to adapt it to the Christian worldview. The Church had educated the knighthood for its religious ideals and ecclesiastical purposes. The protection of the weak now became a knightly point d'honneur. In relation to the external world, the arms of knighthood were put into the service of the struggle against heathens and heretics. The knightly ethos of self-discipline which sprang from the spontaneous spiritual dynamism of this estate, met this ecclesiastical policy halfway. It was ready to acknowledge religious and ethical values, if it saw them in agreement with its esprit de corps and was thus able mentally to digest them. Triuve and staete are virtues immediately intelligible to the vital feelings of a liege man, for triuve, faithfulness, and staete, steadfastness, were merely the mental concomitants and unavoidable implications of the real relationship of the feudal nexus between lord and vassal. By conceiving his relation to God as a personal relation of vassalage and an obligation of honor, belief in God appears to the knightly religious and ethical consciousness as faith in God, triuve, and this accords well with the ecclesiastical concept of constantia in the Church's moral philosophy. And in the same way the knight virtue of meze, moderation, the expression of the predilection, characteristic of this status group, for a noble form of living, for style, harmonizes with the temperantia of the ecclesiastical doctrine, and that milte, generosity, the highest lordly virtue of the knight, in the sense of noblesse oblige, with the virtue of liberalitas taught by the Church. The later development of knighthood shows that the parallels drawn here are far from being tendentious or fanciful, and thus that the ethos of knighthood hardly had any corrective and formative influence on the Christian mentality, quite the contrary. By the 15th century the aristocratic warrior had been transformed into the miles Christianus, or Knight of Christ. In the 10th and 11th centuries the ecclesiastical hierarchy had become sympathetic to the institution of knighthood after realizing that it could be deployed on the Church's behalf. The chevaliers themselves became more devout knights of Christ, indeed, conscious of their membership of Christian society. In consequence, the Christian ethos was intimately bound up with the fully developed cult of chivalry, and there is no doubt that Christian religious feeling colored contemporary views of chivalry, at the end as much as at the beginning of the Middle Ages. In the chivalric value system, the twin goals of which were fame in this world and salvation in the next, martial and Christian qualities were integrated to such an extent that the distinct strands cannot be unraveled. Beside the knightly estate there appeared an estate of burghers and peasants, whose formation followed a similar logic. Urban occupations, which in the flourishing towns offered abundant support through industry and trade to an ever-increasing stratum of the population, brought within the burghal class the most diverse elements of the territorial law. The principle Luft macht frei, free town air makes free, wore down the original contrasts and fused the town population into a legal unit, although indeed social differences, often of great sharpness, persisted or first took form within it. The burghal class also became in a legal sense a blood estate determined by the occupation into which one was born. Within the town law, Wahlspieldrecht, it developed its own law of status, and as the citizenry of the state grew later out of the burghal community, so burghal, bürgerliches, law became the common, civil, law of the whole nation. Among the rural population, also, the distinctions of status connected with the original folk organization became obliterated in course of time, although they did not disappear completely, nor everywhere to the same extent. In some regions free peasants maintained themselves on free soil, though henceforth distinguished by their rustic life from their erstwhile fellows of the knightly and burghal estates. Socially, they constituted one class with the half-free and unfree cultivators of the soil. The peasantry lived under complicated tenurial relations, in the west partly bound to the soil, and partly personally dependent, in the eastern colonized regions originally merely bound to the soil. It was only in the course of the modern period that personal serfdom, Leihbeigesellschaft, found in the latter regions its widest prevalence as a new form of unfreedom. Thus it came that the older estates were gradually displaced by the organization of the folk as knights, burgesses, and peasants, which had reached perfection in the 1100s and 1200s and remained the essential basis of social grouping until the 1800s. In this respect, the important point about the transition from late Merovingian and early Carolingian times to the 11th century is that, if birth, blood, was still the criterion of freedom, of the belonging to this or that class of the Germanic society, the makeup of each of these classes had changed and had lost greatly in homogeneity. The normal correspondence between the nature of individuals and the functions they carry out became an exception. As has been pointed out in the Jewels of the Papacy, it is not exactly true that the Teutonic races that descended from the last offshoots to leave the Arctic seat had not suffered the miscegenation and the alterations experienced by similar populations that had abandoned the Arctic seat much earlier. Miscegenation increased among them, under the necessities of conquest, after they took control of most areas of the Western Roman Empire. For example, the Visigothic nucleus which Alaric had originally commanded in Epirus was quite small. It only swelled to a great army by the junction of adventurers of all sorts, especially that of the 30,000 Foederati in Italy who joined the invader after the murder of Stilicho. Hence in this heterogeneous mass there was no generally recognized noble blood, such as was to be found among more compact nationalities, like the Lombards, Bavarians, or Saxons. Only the former were not a collection of warbands, nor a mixed multitude of diverse races. The only original distinction came from being promoted to official command by the king. But the men who had once been given the appointment of count or duke grew wealthy, acquired lands, and accumulated clients. Their descendants in a few generations formed a true nobility based on wealth and local influence. The Spanish nobles and the English the Gens Hood were originally an aristocracy of service, not of blood, and the Franks in Gaul appear to have had no ancient nobility of blood. The Franks, like the Visigoths, seem to have known no other nobility than that of service. The court officials and provincial dukes and counts of the early Merovingians were drawn from all classes, whether Frankish or not. Most medievalists, not realizing that they strengthen in this respect the racial theories upheld by all serious racist authors, which they have not studied seriously, and not realizing either, of course, the deadly dangers that miscegenation represents for a stock, agree that Teutonic tribes were already the products of miscegenation by the 6th or 7th century. Wealth was a noble thing so long as it was essentially landed property, and belonged to a class that through its race was fitted for ruling, and brought up to own property, and loved wealth not for its own sake, but for the sake of power and treasure and honor. Wealth becomes something mean so soon as a class collects it which does not bring a high mind to the task. It becomes something mean in the history of a people under Nordic influence the moment the non-Nordic man comes to riches. He has not inherited the way of life that befits wealth if it is not to be something base. The purse-proud upstart, the new man, are seldom found among the Nordics. If a Nordic man should be raised from poverty to wealth, he would so have within him the way of life of the original upper class that he would not attract attention. The history of all peoples under Nordic influence shows the figure of the newly rich man with political influence. The Roman satirists often draw his picture, and the moment of his appearance marks racial movement and change. From this moment the decline of the people is hastened. The disruption shows itself in the daily life. Elements from the lower class have become rich. Elements that have built up no idea of honor of their own, that are held back by no traditional sense of dignity from using their wealth to the full. Everything now can be bought, the state can be bought, so can fair hair to make a pretense of noble blood, the nobility itself can be bought. The ideas of the former upper class become ridiculous to the people that is changing, the heroic age lies far behind. Customs belonging to the races of the pre-Nordic populations again make their appearance. Morals change, the class divisions are effaced by an unbounded freedom and restlessness, but, above all, by the rise of the new rich. The racial mixture has broken up the nobility, the new rich control the state, and use their power against the free peasantry, who now have the comparatively purest Nordic blood. The land goes to waste, the towns grow. The general mixture of blood, to which the flow of foreign racial elements contributes, breeds the mob of the great cities, masses of men, who, as a result of the mixed blood, are utterly without goal, and exposed to any and every influence. Even as some of the first had become the last, that is, when, in 841, some of the freemen, reduced as they were to serfdom, undertook an uprising, the so-called Stellinga uprising, which the Annales Fuldenses described as a validissimum conspirationum libertorum legitimos dominos a primere conantium, against the state, against the Saxon and Frankish nobility. No democratic aspirations for political freedom such as those which would grow in the medieval Italian cities as a result of that union between the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom whose synergy Tocqueville will later see at work in America, no inner revolutionary urge, inspired them, let alone that what they threatened was not the principle of authority, the principle of kingship, but fundamental aspects of the social ideology embraced and propagated by medieval Christian kings. Consistent with themselves, they were dedicated to the re-establishment of the tradition of the ancient Saxons. The humanitarian and abstract Paulinian notion of personal freedom as a reward for giving oneself to God, as the ultimate goal of salvation, which resounded in the ears of the Roman proletariat of alien and slave ancestry as the Goths settled in the empire, had no impact on them. On the other hand, it is not surprising that these Germans rose up against the leadership of the theocratic state which had dragged them into bondage. Indeed, Christianity conquest worsened the condition of the Freelingi and Lazi. Charlemagne equated conquest with conversion, and he demanded that all Saxons renounce their tradition and accept baptism under penalty of death. While the Saxon nobles embraced Christianity quite willingly, the Freelingi and Lazi associated the new religion with Frankish oppression. Moreover, the newly erected church compelled all Saxons to pay the tithe, 1/10 of their annual income, to support the local bishop and parish priests. The church stepped into the breach. The forced Christianization of the Saxons and other tribes, with the dramatic economic, social and ethnic changes it brought about, had contributed greatly to open in the Germanic traditional society. Individuals who once drew strength from their family and tribal ties began to feel alone, alienated from their ancestors and tribal bonds. In such a state, the appeal of mystery cults that look not to this world but to the next can be strong. These cults are world-rejecting and can be strongly attractive to individuals and societies experiencing a breakdown of the known world around them. An early example of this lies in classical Greece. Originally, she held to an Indo-European religion the Greeks considered to come from the north. As society changed and became more cosmopolitan, the people began to look eastwards to the world-rejecting mystery cults. This process is exemplified in Alexander the Great's policy of hegemony, ecumenism or cosmopolitanism. These cults offered a different sense of community, one based on shared belief and practice rather than ethnic ancestry. As the old tribe structures broke down, so the church began to take its place by offering food, shelter, education and many other social services that disenfranchised people found very attractive. What should always be borne in mind and always kept in sight in this respect is, on the one hand, that the audience mainly targeted by early Christian propaganda in Rome and on our continent was the lower classes, slaves and women, that is, elements which, by nature, are not and cannot be absolutely free, for which absolute freedom can only stand as an aspiration and develop as a longing, a craving, which reflects in turn an essential lack of freedom, and, on the other hand, that the only freedom that could be offered to them was an abstract, formal, inward and spiritual freedom. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty, which, however, could not but result in a boomerang effect. Nature abhors a vacuum, specially, so to speak, an inner vacuum, and be led ultimately to assert itself in a political, social, and economic setting. Whereas, in the early Germanic society, freedom was exclusively based on a person's kinship, who was the legitimate offspring of the freemen of society, Freobeern, and, as such, had the right to participate in political decision-making and to bear arms, which was also a duty. Again, the idea free, from the Old High German free, developed from nothing else than the concept of legitimate, full-fledged membership of the kindred or tribe. The Platonic conception of freedom as independent self-determination in the sense of self-control, of the neutralization of passions, on which Paul drew so largely, peppering it with standard themes of Socratism and Stoic conceptions on an internal freedom over against the things of this world, a potential retreat into inwardness, is not found in the Politics of Aristotle, whose definitions of Eleutheria are quite consistent with the true Hellenic traditions, any more than it is found in the mental universe of the early Freihaus. The difference, in nature, and not in degree, between Freihaus and the Christian concept of freedom is so abyssal that Freihaus was about the only key word of the Germanic vocabulary that contemporary translators did not even bother to Christianize. Little wonder that women were more intensively involved in the dissemination of Christianity than the sources with their androcentric coloring at first give us to understand. The way was first showed by the women who were part of the group of Jesus Christ. Remarkably few women in the early Jesus movement appeared to conform to the most socially acceptable categories of virgin daughter, respectable wife, and mother of legitimate children. Frequently, they are anomalous not merely by virtue of their gender, but also by additional marginal traits, often specific to women. Little wonder either that many women rose to positions of power in early Christian movements, and many measures which repressed the activity of women in the Church at first had little success, since the Hellenistic Roman women who became Christians were not going to submit to discipline lightly. Though they had no access to political, they were nevertheless emancipated in the literal sense. They were no longer under the manus, hand, in the sense of power and protection, of a spouse, but were free partners and economically independent to the degree that they had personal resources. So it was quite possible for women of the upper class to lead their own lives even within marriage. This explains why there are no indications in the sources that women hoped for an improvement of their condition as women by going over to Christianity. Nevertheless, many women who were still single or had again become single decided against a traditional family life. So widows now played a significant role in the communities, as soon also did virgins, young women who had resolved from the start not to get married. These voluntarily celibate Christian women created organizations within the churches which are unique in contemporary Hellenism on this scale. In Christianity, alternative forms of life were now possible for a large group of women, forms of life which were not defined by biological determination. This institutionalization guaranteed women both material provisions and a high degree of social recognition. Thus, the association of women with a particular social role was broken through and transcended. The opportunity was provided in the institutional Christian framework for women desirous to divorce themselves from domestic responsibilities. Ascetic Christianity, in fact, offered women a new measure of worth which involved a rejection of their traditional roles. The women who choose celibacy did, for a time, and in some places, gain a degree of autonomy. The objection that emancipating women, who were leaders in churches prior to the 3rd and 4th centuries, were later precluded from the ministry of the church, from any position of power in the church and, more specifically, from any involvement in the rites and ceremonial forms of a religion seemingly tailored for their psyche, with its emphasis on feeling and emotion, personal liberty and universal equality, with the immortal soul as a carrot and the original sin as a stick, misses the point. It is outweighed by the fact that ecclesiastics, in accordance with the nature of the values with which they are suffused, are often feminine beings psychologically, mentally, and spiritually. Besides, it does not take into account that the energies released by the frustrated impulse to freedom and the broken dream of empowerment were to be transferred gradually from their original object to a substitute, to any field of worldly activity, from economy to the social, cultural and political spheres, in which they acted as powerful disintegrative forces. To proceed further along the lines of the occult war, it can also be pointed out that emancipating Christian women were put back in their place by the ecclesiastic hierarchy after they had served their purpose in helping the church to emancipate. To a certain extent, it can be said that a true emancipation of women in the Church would have been largely incompatible with or, at least, would have bridled a full emancipation of women through Christianity in the long run. The way to women's liberation, which was not opened by Christianity, but by various religious manifestations of the Spirit of which Christianity was later only one particular form, was to be long. The development of the de facto freedom of Roman women, the decline in the powers of the father and husband of a woman, the breakup of the traditional Roman family, the development of reciprocal obligations of spouses in divorce, do not go back to the advent of Judeo-Christianity, yet, these developments are to be brought back to the zymosis of an alien and adulterating, not to say infecting, residue, which persisted in ancient Rome and which eventually crystallized into Judeo-Christianity. Fortunately, from a white standpoint, there were still forces at work which always sought to limit the equal treatment of Jews and Greeks, freemen and slaves, men and women. What is systematically overlooked in most scholarly works on this subject is the main thing, the inner liberation of women, that is, in concrete terms, the freeing, through their individuality and by means of incantations such as Galatians 3:28, of what lies within women in terms of undifferentiated forces, which, indeed, are neither masculine nor feminine. Once these forces were freed, it was only a matter of time before the outer economic, social, cultural, legal and political liberation of women was achieved. No matter how misogynist the writings of the Church Fathers and of their successors could be, how often she was reminded that she was an embodiment of evil and a creature congenitally weak and inferior, how resounding was the rebuttal that social, economical, cultural and political conditions provided to the teaching that both males and females enjoyed the same freedom on the basis of their identity in Christ, how aware she was that freedom with a capital F could only be realized through asceticism or virginity. The newly found inner kingdom was there for her to retreat in and to act out the craving, fueled by the rewarding lure of the immortality of the soul and of the equality of all human beings before God, that was burning inside her for emancipation, for liberation, for freedom, in the outer kingdom. Besides, the Christian emphasis on the subjective standpoint cannot but appeal to and make a deep impact on waxy beings like women. There is a close link between the rise of Christianity and the discovery of subjectivity at the root of modern individualism. Christianity underlines the importance of the institutionalization of the individual. Christianity is not merely a faith, but a social community, a world built according to the will and teaching of the Creator and Savior. Between the natural or carnal human being, and the human being, who has been transformed by the act of baptism into Homo Christianus, there is an enormous gulf that can be bridged only through the act of initiation. The act of baptism constitutes the profound transformation of the very essence of the human being, no less, the incorporation of the natural human being into the community of the faithful. Through this act a human being acquires the chance of salvation. He or she absorbs the cultural code of the Christian community, its principles and norms, the human being becomes a person. A text of 1234 AD states, "Through baptism in the Church of Christ a man becomes a person." What the Middle Ages inherited from classical times, anthropologically speaking, was no straightforward legacy. In the Greco-Roman period the concept person did not exist. The Greek word prosopon and the Latin persona served to denote a theatrical mask. A mask is not only not a person but probably the very opposite, and the evolution that the term persona underwent over the course of many centuries can testify to the efforts that were undertaken by various cultures before Europeans succeeded in investing that term with the content which might express the essence of the human personality. The persona, behind which the actor in classical drama might conceal his true face, did not presuppose any personality, just as an abstract juridical person lacked one. Such a person was merely a symbol for legal capability which, in Roman law, went by the name persona. Classical thinkers would see the term persona as signifying, above all, a social role that had been assigned by society to one or other of its members. This term was used in the world of the theater or court procedure and was not linked with the field of psychology. Another concept just as close in meaning to the term persona was character, which was linked to the sphere of the mind only insofar as it bore an imprint of something, just as some material might have an impression made on it. The word character was interchangeable with stamp, brand or imprint. These concepts are distinguished by their static nature and they indicated to people or to groups of people the place allocated to them within the framework of the system. The identity of persons is determined from without, laid down in advance by institutions and objective considerations, but it does not reflect any subjective elements or shared emotional experiences. Indeed, there seems to have been no awareness of individuality in ancient times. People were not aware of themselves as individuals and did not conceive of their heathen deities in that light, they saw them as personified forces of one kind or another rather than as individuals. The beautiful, harmonious and well-proportioned bodies of classical sculpture did not portray individuals, their souls did not reflect the uniqueness of the human being, the vessel containing the divine principle. In the person of Augustine, Christianity made a major advance towards penetrating the individual's inner space and in achieving a more profound understanding of the individual. The human ego was discovered and came to be viewed as the combination of substance endowed with awareness and a will and a personality capable of reasoning and of emotion. In contrast to the concentration of the classical era on fate, Augustine declared, "I, not fate, not destiny, not the devil. The center of the world was the ego, face to face with its creator." Augustine responds with dramatic emotion to the experiences of his path through life, which led from his sinful excesses as a young man to his discovery of the true God. Self-knowledge was presented as knowledge of God, the path to God. Even before Augustine, such works as the Confession of Cyprianus or On the Trinity by Augustine's contemporary, Hilarius, had been written, but it was the Confessions of the Bishop of Hippo which introduced into our culture a new paradigm for the self-expression of the individual. Now the early German, whose imaginative powers are not easily roused, but rather show a calm evenness, while not lacking in boldness, and even extravagance, had little talent or taste for introspection, and was incapable of any worship which scorned external helps and which needed only the fervor of the heart. Immersed in the softening atmosphere of the new religion, his relation to the sacred could not fail to undergo a process of individualization. To put it briefly, Christianity forbade that a man's future should be merged, after the heathen fashion, in the future of his family or clan. It treated him as an individual and mediated directly between him and God. This personal religion began by slow degrees to take its place in the midst of collective and ceremonial religion, and thus arose that great modern fact which we call sentiment. Contrast the ceremonial worship of a heathen clan with the personal sentiment of a medieval hymn. Contrast the chorus, the feast, the wide heathen publicity of worship, and the Church took care to preserve a plenty of this element, with the direct and piercing individualism of the monk. State and family religion, with the head of state or family as priest, yielded ground to the personal expression of awe, of reverence, of love. The mere sense of conduct, modern writers would say, became the sense of conduct touched by emotion. An attempt was made to subjectivize the living concepts and rites of the Germanic cult. Through religious sentimentalism, for example, the Feelgia, a supernatural entity acting as a guardian and protector spirit both for the clan and for the individuals conceived of as part of a lineage and following an individual from each generation, degenerated into a personal guardian angel, until, one thing leading fatally another, the so-called worship of nature became the actual worship of oneself. Besides, it goes without saying that none of the Germanic core values, honor and loyalty, were looked favorable by the Church. Honor should be understood in the sense of glory, splendor or everlasting fame. It was a notion of external approval and praise being granted by the chieftain and tribe for acts of great courage performed on behalf of the tribe. This externalized concept of honor stemmed from a desire not to be publicly shamed and can be contrasted with the Christian concept of internalized honor based on guilt and personal sin. Central to the Indo-European society was the idea of war and the heroic warrior cult as a religious practice. This was probably because of the central importance of the warrior to defending the homeland and to winning more territory for the expanding tribe to farm. Thus, the warrior and farming classes were closely interrelated and depended on each other. The warrior code was itself central to the social bonds that defined the tribe and gave it such strength. This was a code based on honor, bravery and the winning of eternal glory. The poem Havamal, attributed to the sayings of Odin, puts it succinctly. Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself will die, but fair fame will never die for him who wins it. Nowhere else was this ethos as strongly embedded into social structure as it was in the Germanic society. Warriors were bound to their lord by an oath of loyalty that they could not break. They would be expected to fight for and defend their lord in battle even if that meant their own death. In fact, surviving a battle in which the king was killed was a great shame to the warrior. However, the king was bound to his warriors by the same code, bound to gain favor from the gods in both battle and agriculture. This favor with the gods formed the basis of the Germanic notion of holiness to which the words holy, healthy and hail were originally applied. As the process of Christianization took hold, so the concept of holiness changed to one of personal holiness. This concept of loyalty to the warlord and folk group was so central to Germanic society and worldview, and so different to the cosmopolitan Christian worldview, that the early missionaries simply could not directly oppose it. Instead, they sought to present their religion in a way that was compatible with this worldview and then sought to slowly adapt society to true Christian values. By coercion, by imperceptible degrees, the Church of the Middle Ages aimed at influencing and conditioning emotions, motives, reasoning, attitudes and behaviors in order to achieve objectives which were not limited to the social and political realm. It had the means of its ambitions. As a visible organization, she never had greater power over the minds of men. She controlled all departments of life from the cradle to the grave. Every aspect of people's life was checked by a self-righteous discourse. Nothing remained hidden to this all-seeing eye, especially sexuality, which became the object of a thorough investigation. The theology of the 7 deadly sins became officially part of the basic elements which any priest was expected to know and which he was legally required to expound to his flock. From their pulpits, vociferous orators would throw their parishioners into the fires of hell and count the very few survivors upon their fingers. The requirement of yearly confession was enforced. A terrible God, more a judge than a father, despite the mercy with which he was almost accidentally credited. A divine justice connected to vengeance. The conviction that, despite redemption, there would remain only a chosen few, all humanity having deserved hellfire because of original sin. The certainty that each sin is both insult and injury to God. The rejection of any amusement or concession to human nature, since these remove one from salvation. The relentless hammering of all these topics into people's head in sermons from the early 13th century to the 17th century, led to the emergence of a Western guilt culture whose pathological symptoms had been dormant since the dissemination of Augustine's pessimistic and even morbid interpretation of the dogma of original sin in the 5th century. From the early 13th century, the representation of a depraved humanity pervaded the whole personal and public space, through philosophical treatises, theological tracts, confession manuals, prayer books, sermons, painting, sculpture, etc. In one treatise published in 1523, a doctor, Bartolomeo Spina of the Holy See, replies to the question, "Why does God let innocent people die?" with the following words. He does so with just cause, for though they do not die because of the sins they have committed, they still die guilty of original sin. Persons who accepted this narrative as truth believed that there was something wrong with them. In addition to being criminals as a result of original sin, they were impure, diseased. The visceral fear of God led to the cultivation of introspection. The issues of grace, of predestination, of sin and of salvation turned into obsessions. The new man was being born.